So you guys know what an adverb clause is. We've talked about that quite a bit. Today we're going to talk about adjective clauses. And it's still a clause, so it still has a subject and a verb in it. Adjective clauses are dependent, so they have a clause starter at the beginning of them. But instead of modifying modifying a verb like an adverb clause does, they modify a noun just like an adjective does. So an adjective clause performs the same function that an adjective performs. Okay, so I'm going to show you one so that you know what I'm talking about. So this first one says, I like the black cat. Now the word black there, let me get the light out of it. The word black is just an adjective. It's just one word. It's not a clause. There's no subject. There's no verb. It's just an adjective describing the word cat. Okay. Now you see in the next sentence we have an entire clause that does the same thing. I like the cat that is black. Okay, so it has a clause starter, the word that. We haven't talked about that clause starter yet, but we will in a second. And then it has a subject and a verb. Now the subject is also that. That is subject verb, okay? So if you see on the next line, who, whom, whose, which, and that, those are your clause starters for adjective clauses, okay? You guys have seen these a lot. I'm sure they'll be pretty familiar to you, okay? So look down at the next sentence. Abraham Lincoln, who was the 16th president of the United States, let me see if I can read my words backwards here. They're displaying backwards. Was dedicated to the preservation of the Union, okay? So you can see there, the part that I have in green is the adjective clause, who was the 16th president of the United States. That is an adjective clause telling you more about Abraham Lincoln, okay? So it is defining him. Who are we talking about? What's he like, okay? Now, do you see the words they only have in black? Abraham Lincoln was dedicated to the preservation of the Union. That is an independent clause, but it's being interrupted by the adjective clause, and that happens a lot. You'll see that. Do you see how the adjective clause has a comma before it, after the word Lincoln, and a comma after the word state? So a comma before and after the adjective clause. We'll talk more about whether they receive commas or not. Some of them do and some of them don't, but we're not worried about that right now. Okay? So this is the adjective clause. Just make sure you know what they start with. Who, whom, whose, which, and that. And in the next, in section 1, the very first section for this video, you're going to pick an adjective clause to fill in the blank. So there'll be a sentence, and it'll be missing the middle section, and then you're going to pick an adjective clause. So make sure it starts with one of these clause starters, and also make sure it has a subject and a verb in it, okay? All right, you guys are ready to take section 1. Okay, so adjective clauses can be just a tiny bit tricky because sometimes the clause starter is missing from the beginning. So they're a little bit harder to identify when that happens. Let me show you what I mean, okay? This says, the class I like most is algebra, okay? The green part there is actually the adjective clause, the I like most. Now, if we put the word that in front of it, it still makes sense. The class that I like most is algebra. We just don't always say the word that whenever we're putting an adjective clause into a sentence. Sometimes I think you could put the word who there. So if you're not sure, in the next exercise, you're going to be choosing what the adjective clause is from a sentence like this. It might say, you might have the whole sentence, the cat I like most is algebra, and then you'll have to choose which part of that sentence is the adjective clause. Now, if it's one, they're not all that difficult, but if it's one like this one where the adjective clause starter is invisible, then just look at your options and ask yourself if putting the word who or that or another clause starter will make that sentence make sense, okay? If it still makes sense, then you know you found your adjective clause. Okay, I don't think it's going to be that hard. Go ahead and look at section 2. Again, if you get one wrong, look at the feedback and hopefully that'll explain it out for you. Then you can retake it if you want to, but you don't have to. Okay, I wrote the clause starters here again. These are the adjective clause starters. And good luck on that, guys. Okay, let me show you guys one more thing about the adjective clause. Some of the adjective clauses are essential to the sentence, which means we really need them in there. And some of them are non-essential, which means they just add interesting information. Okay, you could get by without putting that in the sentence, but go ahead and put it in there anyway. Okay, so I want to show you an essential adjective clause. It says, cars that are red get you into the most trouble. And it's true. I think cops will pull you over more often if your car is red. Anyway, so this says, so do you see that the clause there, that are red? See how there's no commas around that? That means we really need that clause in the sentence. And the reason that we need it is because we don't know which cars are being spoken of unless somebody tells us. We could just say cars get you into the most trouble. Now, if you were already talking about a whole bunch of things like cars or bikes or things like that, that would be understood. But just this sentence by itself, cars get you into the most trouble. Well, what kind of cars? If the adjective clause tells you which one you're talking about out of many possibilities, then that adjective clause is essential to the sentence. Okay? So cars that are red. Okay? If you look at the next sentence, you can see the 1904 World's Fair, which took place in St. Louis, was the birthplace of the waffle cone. Okay? So we already know we're talking about the 1904 World's Fair. We don't need someone to tell us which World's Fair we're talking about because it already says the 1904 World's Fair. So this clause, this adjective clause, which took place in St. Louis, that is non-essential. We don't really need it in there. Now, it does make it more interesting. It adds a little bit more information. But since we don't really need it to know which subject we're talking about, then we set it off with commas on both sides. So you see how there's a comma after fair right before the clause starts, and then there's a comma after Louis right at the end of the clause. Okay? Also, I want to tell you guys that an adjective clause can also come at the very end of a sentence. I gave a freeze pop to Amelia, who had just skinned her knee in the parking lot. Okay, so that entire adjective clause comes at the end of a sentence, so it gets a comma before it and a period after it, but still it's being set apart from the rest of the sentence. Okay, so one more time, guys, up here. If there's any, if you need to know which out of the possibilities is being spoken of, then the adjective clause that tells us that information is essential and does not receive commas. Okay? But if, like in this sentence, if you already know who or what is being spoken of, then the adjective clause is non-essential. You don't really need it, but put commas around it, okay? All right, so I think that's section 3. I think that's all the sections there are in this quiz. I will link the quiz below in the description of the video. And if you wind up on the quiz first, I'll link back to the video there. So you guys leave me some feedback, give me positive, negative. It doesn't make me any difference. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye.